Hi everybody, welcome to Quarateg's Hive Network, where today we will be discussing racism at work, and we are joined by Professor Binna Kandola. We'll be shortly hearing a bit more from Binna, but in the meantime we will get started. So I am your host for today. I am Emma Tamplin. I'm just going to put my webcam on actually. There you go, you can see me. Hi everybody, I'm Emma Tamplin. I'm a collaboration manager at Quarateg, and I'm responsible for delivering a number of amazing initiatives to help women and girls reach their full potential. And I also run a lot of great networks as well, including Hive for employers, which brings employers together to share and learn best practice. We're also joined behind the scenes by my amazing colleague, Alexia May. Without Alexia, these events just wouldn't happen, and she's all things tech. Without her, who knows what would happen. So yeah, we are here with you today. Before we get started, I just want to do a couple of technical checks to make sure that you can see and hear me okay. On the right-hand side of your screens, you'll see a toolbar. There'll be an orange button with a white arrow. If you click on that white arrow, it opens up the webinar toolbar. And on there, you won't be able to see us today, but you won't be able to hear us. No, sorry, you'll be able to see and hear us today. We won't be able to see or hear you. But if you want to interact with us at all, then you can use the questions tab in the toolbar. Just pop in any questions. If you have any questions for me about Quarateg, or about anything you hear from Binna today, then please pop them in the questions tab, and we'll answer those a bit later. We will be recording the sessions as well, so if anybody's not able to make today, they can watch it back. We have all of these saved on our YouTube channel, which we can send the links to later. Okay, so if you're having any problems, please pop a question in the question tab, and Alexia will help you as soon as she can. Okay, Quarateg. Quarateg is a leading gender equality charity here in Wales, and for almost 30 years now, we have been working to ensure that women can enter the workplace, develop skills, and build rewarding careers. And we have a vision of a Wales where every woman and girl is treated equally and is able to fully participate in the economy, in public and political life, and live safe from violence and fear. We are an organisation of fierce feminists who work to disrupt and dismantle the systems and structures that oppress and prevent women from reaching their full potential. And we offer a number of really great initiatives for women and girls and for employers as well. And we also work closely with decision makers and government in Wales to ensure that our country is fair and inclusive for women, to ensure that they have a platform for their voices to be heard. So the Hive community, in usual circumstances, we would meet 3 times a year across Wales in live face-to-face events, and we would bring along awesome guest speakers and discuss really topical things that businesses in Wales need today. And in the last 16 months or so, we have moved Hive online and running these events virtually, which is working really well. Actually, the numbers have really increased, and we're able to reach a wider audience across Wales as well, and also bring in speakers from as far and wide as we can. And Binna actually joins us from across the pond, so it's great to have him here today. Yeah, so the Hive community is running virtually. We've covered really great topics in the past online, looking around agile working, mental health and well-being in the workplace since the pandemic started, looking at how disabilities, the societies, the disability, and all these are all available on our YouTube channel. So if you do want to check them out, they'll all be on there. So as I mentioned, we are joined by Professor Binna Kandola today, who's going to talk to us about racism at work, and I'm going to hand over him to you now. Okay, so bear with me while I just change presenter. There we go. There we go, Binna, all over to you. Just going to move.
Thanks, Emma, and welcome everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm a big fan of Quarateg, and it's always I enjoy being able to support them in their work in any way that I can, and because I love the work the organisation does, and I've drawn upon it myself. So it's great to be able to give something back to the organisation. Topic today is called racism at work. I'm a business psychologist, and actually I wrote a book 3 years ago called Racism at Work: The Danger of Indifference. Subtitle is important because up until that point, I think we had been indifferent to the topic of race. And of course, in the last year, things have changed, and a lot more attention, long overdue, has been given to the topic. But I was asked to give a talk. At a Big Four accountancy firm soon after the book came out, actually. I gave a talk in the organisation, and there was a racist in the room who I challenged. I was then challenged for challenging the racist in this big four accountancy firm. I then insisted that I met the senior partner and chairman of the firm. It's a big four, it's a global organisation. This, and I told him why I wanted to meet him. There was racism. There's a racist in the room, and then he said to me that I need to look at it from their point of view, i.e. the racist point of view. So this is the senior partner and chairman of the big four accountancy firm. He said that I need to look at it from the racist point of view. At no point in our meeting, which was meant to last an hour to discuss racism in his firm, he couldn't make it last more than 40 minutes. When I blamed him for what was going on, I found myself back on the street 5 minutes later. At no point did he express any concern for the minorities who were present in that room, who were having to listen to this individual, and who incidentally remained silent. There were very few partners in that room. They had expected 80, they got about half that number. The majority of those were minorities, which is not representative of the organisation at all. At no point did he express concern for them. But he did say that I need to look at it from the racist point of view. I was at a conference, and the chair of the conference, in her opening remarks, that I was doing a keynote after her, in her opening remarks on diversity and inclusion, she said, we need to move beyond race. I get that, when we kind of talk about intersectionalities, that rather grand word that gets used, we talk about that, and that's what her point is. We need to look at things in an intersectional way, we need to move beyond race. But this was a conference about race. This was a conference about race. I remember sitting there thinking, yeah, maybe we do need to move beyond race, but not today. Not today. Today is about race. It's like turning up for a conference about jam and then only to hear the chair of the conference say, we're going to move beyond jam, so we're going to talk about ketchup instead. And at the same conference, somebody said that I genuinely don't see colour. I genuinely don't. Is a keynote speaker. I genuinely don't see colour, and you could hear the sigh of relief in the audience that everybody else thinking, yeah, if you don't, I don't. It's not an issue for us. This was less than a year and a half ago, so before lockdown. I genuinely don't see colour. And this was somebody who was then the global head of diversity and inclusion, a media organisation, who then got promoted, spouting nonsense like this, to another organisation. He's then moved on again. He's got promoted to an even bigger job now. So it obviously doesn't stop him from getting bigger jobs. And at the same conference, somebody said, it's a generational issue. My children's generation don't see colour. It's a generation. So her point was that the younger generation just don't see race in the same sort of way. Racism is going to be eradicated naturally as the younger generation come through. She actually said that by the time her children join the workforce, she thinks that racism will be a thing of the past. And as her children are already in their teens, we don't have to wait that long. And boy, is that a pressure to put on their shoulders. There's yet another global head of diversity and inclusion. And then we have this tool, which is it's a stereotype busting tool, where it attempts to use psychology to stop us, to try and train ourselves to stop stereotypes being activated. She did this, and her response was, I don't like that test. And it's not a test, but I don't like that test because I genuinely don't see colour. This was less than a year ago. And guess what her job is? Now, these are people whose jobs there are to kind of know about this stuff and to combat racism and injustices in the workplace. And they are saying this sort of thing. They were saying this sort of thing. And is it little wonder that organisations were indifferent to the topic of the race? These individuals couldn't be bothered to learn more about the topic themselves. Things have changed. The murder of George Floyd, Black Lives Matter, anti-Chinese prejudice, all of that has meant that organisations are now paying a lot more attention to this than they ever did before. But they've been forced into it. Before all of that, we were ignorant of it. Now, I want to go back in time, actually. So as Alessandro de' Medici, the Duke of Florence and the head of the powerful Medici family, rode into Rome one day in 1535, he couldn't help noticing the graffiti that was scrawled on the walls, which said, Hail Alessandro of Colovecchio. Now, he was there Alessandro to meet Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, to answer charges levelled against him by exiled Florentines. And you might think that this was a welcome, that they were expressing their support, or the locals were expressing their support for him by expressing, by greeting him in this way. In fact, the graffiti was an insult. Collavecchia was the village where his mother was born. And Alessandro's mother was a freed slave. So the reference taunted Medici Duke on his humble origins and let him know that not everyone accepted his authority. Right. The fact that Alessandro was black wasn't mentioned. If the Romans had thought to mention Alessandro's colour, it would not have been seen as an insult, but as an irrelevant detail. It was his social status, not his physical appearance, which people noted, judged, and used as a weapon. Now, it's difficult to identify precisely when the change in views about people of a different colour took place, but we do know a change occurred around the time of the slave trade. In the early 16th century, the colour of someone's skin was not seen as an indicator of someone's personality, qualities, or intellect. By the 19th century, this had changed dramatically, and the ideas of the so-called science of race, the idea that some human beings were superior to others, now permeated everyday life. And it was believed that there's a strong relationship between a person's physical features and attributes such as intelligence. The English writer Thomas Adolphus Trollope, a pillar of the British community in 19th century Italy, saw in a portrait of Duke Alessandro not a leader, but a wretched youth. And he continued, the small contracted features, the low forehead and mean expression are altogether unlike any of the Medici race, in whom, whoever else they might be, there was always the manifestation of intellectual power. So based on appearance alone, Trollope deems Alessandro atypical of the powerful, wealthy and intelligent Medici clan. Fascists in the 20th century would seek to deny that Alessandro's mother could ever have been African. So in the intervening years between the Roman public's assessment of the Duke's person and Trollope's damning classification of his portrait, the basis of judgment had changed radically. And by any measure, this was a remarkably rapid as well as a fundamental transformation. Once an irrelevance, colour had now gained the power to tell us everything we needed to know about a person's intellect and character. For much of human history, people did not stereotype others based on the colour of their skin. For much of human history, people did not stereotype others based on the colour of their skin. Racial or colour prejudice, as we know it today, did not exist during the times of the Egyptian, Greek and Roman empires. Racial prejudice, therefore, is not an inherent human function. We created races, and in so doing, we created racial prejudice. Frank Snowden, the Harvard history professor, describes this in his book, Before Colour Prejudice. And the provocation in the title is in the word before. To our modern sensibilities, it doesn't quite make sense. As colour prejudice is something that we've had to battle with, it's difficult to conceive of a time when it genuinely did not exist. The key dividing lines between people were religion, culture, and language, not the colour of someone's skin. The Egyptians, for example, had long had contact with black people from the Kush, now Sudan and South Sudan. They had traded, worked, and fought alongside one another. The Egyptians did not consider the Kushite skin colour significant or unusual. And these equable views about black people did not change from Egyptian times to the Roman era, a period of several thousand years, during which time intermarriage and intermating were not frowned upon. Writers and philosophers such as Pliny, Menander, Machiavelli all recognized that aspects of human character such as virtue, courage, justice, piety, wisdom, magnanimity, and fortitude could be possessed by anyone, regardless of their colour. The Bible's references to black people are similarly positive. While some people may know that Moses married a Cushite, they may not realize that she must have been black. When Miriam, his sister, is annoyed with Moses' choice of wife, it is Miriam who is punished. Of course, there was xenophobia. People who were not Egyptian, Greek, or Roman were considered to be inferior, but this was due to culture, language, and dress, not their colour. In the summer of 2017, an extraordinary row blew up over a character of all things, a children's cartoon on CBBC. The programme showed what life was like in Roman Britain. One of the main characters, a Roman general, was the focus of the controversy because he was black. The tone of the debate was a familiar one. This is political correctness gone mad, the critics claimed. Far from being politically correct, it was in fact historically accurate, the character being loosely based on Quintus Lollius Urbicus, the Governor General of Britain, who came from Africa. And there's also a story, a contemporary story told about a Roman woman who, when stopped by a group of officials, tried to get out of her predicament by saying that she was an African princess. I like to think her offence was travelling while white. So why did this change? How did someone's skin colour come to define them and to invalidate their virtues? Colour was an irrelevance to philosophers, politicians, priests, and God. Well, it was due to a combination of factors, the first of which was the dawning realization that there was good money to be made in the transatlantic slave trade. So let's imagine the slide towards modern notions of race and racism can be crystallized into a tipping point. I will choose the 8th of August, 1444, when the first large European slave market was conducted on the outskirts of Lagos in Portugal. A fleet blessed by Prince Henry the Navigator, who donated his proceeds of the auction to the church, returned from Mauritania with a cargo of 235 black Africans. The expedition was mounted in the name of the Order of Christ, and the commander of the expedition was knighted for his achievement. The slave trade, therefore, was inaugurated as a godly, profitable, and worthy enterprise. And it was bolstered by the simple belief that some people were inferior to others. Papal bulls gave the slave trade a legal as well as a religious basis, and anything that could support this was used, whether it was bogus science or obscure passages from the Bible. There's a somewhat confusing story in Genesis, which concludes, and I quote, "And he said, cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants shall he be to his brethren." This Genesis chapter 9, verse 25. And this has come to be known as the curse of Ham. Even learned theologians find this passage difficult to understand. Nevertheless, it came to be used as a biblical justification for the notion of racial differences. Politicians, philosophers, scientists all contributed to the belief that some people were inferior to others based on the colour of their skin. Carl Linnaeus, a remarkable 18th century botanist some of whose discoveries and philosophies are in use today, identified 5 varieties of Homo sapiens: American, European, Asian, African, and monstrous. He created a hierarchy with Africans and Asians at the bottom. His supporters state that he was Eurocentric rather than racist because he didn't see people's position as fixed. Education determined that. Nevertheless, his work was turned by others, notably the German scientist Johann Friedrich Blumenbach, into a rigid hierarchy with Caucasian at the top, followed by Mongolian, then Malay, American Indian, and Ethiopian, or put more simply, white, yellow, brown, red, and black. And these views were supported and propagated by, amongst others, Jefferson, Kant, Hume, Hegel, Voltaire, Galton, and de Gobineau. Dr. George Samuel Morton amassed an impressive collection of over 800 skulls, which he measured. His thinking was the bigger the skull, the bigger the brain, and so the greater the intelligence. he found that Africans, Indians and Chinese had the smallest skulls, the largest skulls, and so the biggest brains and the highest intelligence belonged to the English. It was later found that he had falsified his measurements. Now, as well as the slave trade, the religious and societal underpinnings were challenged, and the transatlantic slave trade thrived until the mid-19th century, by which time much of the world had been colonized by European nations. But although the slave ships no longer ply the oceans, the trade's cultural legacy lives on today. And that colour hierarchy that I demonstrated, I just mentioned to you, in my research, I kind of think it's still in place. Every country I looked at, I've simplified it. It's essentially white at the top, black at the bottom, and everybody else in between. Now, essentially, sometimes white at the top will be joined by somebody in the middle. Sometimes black people at the bottom will be joined by somebody in the middle. But white at the top, black at the bottom is kind of the framework. And during the times we're living now, so bear that in mind, because I'm going to be coming back to this. We live in these extraordinary times of a pandemic, and at times of pandemics and plagues, xenophobia and prejudice increases, and scapegoating goes on. We blame a particular community. More recent examples in 1901, with the bubonic plague in Cape Town, the black population were forcibly removed and made to live in encampments outside the city. It was because it's believed that they were spreading bubonic plague. It was one of the blueprints for apartheid, which occurred later. There's been long-standing suspicions of Muslims traveling to and from Mecca, for example, and one, particularly at times like this, one historian said it's the longest-standing surveillance exercise in history. During the Second World War, Himmler said that one of the reasons that Jews had to be dealt with and exterminated is because he said that they were spreading typhus, and so it was a matter of cleanliness. We know that darker skins, as psychologists, that darker skins are associated with germs. During the beginning of this pandemic, the former Deputy Prime Minister of Italy said the reason why they had the pandemic in Italy was because of the presence of Africans. And of course, we've got this notion of the Chinese virus. We carried out research last year, got research coming out this year, which has shown just the horrendous, disgusting, ugly behaviours that people of Chinese heritage are subjected to, and the kind of lack of interest there is in this as a topic. Actually, 50% of British-born Chinese people told us last year that they'd experienced directly racism towards them since the start of the pandemic, and it had gone up since we last surveyed them. So the times we live in are important. Taking a longer perspective, say at the last half a century, without doubt, there has been a sea change in our attitudes on race. We are far more accepting of having minorities as friends, as colleagues, as neighbours, as partners, and we are far less accepting of racist attitudes and behaviours. And that has led some commentators to conclude that racism is on its way to being eradicated. And that's why you get this indifference, like there's some of those examples I gave you earlier. Racism, it's a thing of the past. Not now, and if it does happen now, it doesn't happen here. If it does happen here, it's not me that's doing it. The type of behaviours that we focus in on when we talk about racism tend to be the very obvious, direct, ugly behaviours. Psychologists refer to this as old-fashioned racism. But racism is mutated like a virus, and there are now forms of racism which psychologists refer to as modern racism, and this is subtle, it's oblique, it's indirect, and you may not even be aware it's going on unless you're on the receiving end, in which case you know that something isn't quite right here. In fact, it's the ambiguity of the behaviour, which means that type of behaviour, the subtle behaviours, have a much longer term negative impact on people's physical and psychological well-being than the obvious behaviours. Stressful as they are, the subtle behaviours have a much bigger effect. And modern racism, and the evidence comes from a variety of sources actually. We've got the implicit association test, which I'm sure you're familiar with, the Harvard bias test, sometimes it's called. If you haven't tried it, give it a go. It was an eye-opening experience for me when I did it. There's multi-million-pound technological wonders called fMRI scanners, which look at blood flow activity in the brain and have demonstrated that we show the degree of empathy we show towards somebody of the same or different colour. Now, these are fabulous tools, very expensive, very sophisticated. But I want to work on something which is cheaper, far simpler, and much older than any of those things. They're believed to have been invented by Leonardo da Vinci, and it's the CV. You can take your mics off actually if you want to participate in this. There used to be a game show in the late 70s, early 80s called Play Your Cards Right, which Bruce Forsyth used to host. The game is very simple. Brucey would have these giant playing cards, the backs of which were turned to the competitors, and then he would turn the first card over. And all the competitors had to do was actually say whether the next card in the sequence was higher or lower in value than the first one, and so they go down the line. All right, that's the game. I've made my own version of this using CV research. The CV research uses a paradigm that you'll be familiar with. It's where you have an organisation has sent two CVs, which are identical in all respects, apart from the name. Right? And what the researchers are interested in, if you change the perceived ethnicity of the individual by the name, does that impact their chances of being shortlisted? So we're going to use that, right? So what I'm going to do is show you your cards, 2 rounds. All you have to say, you can unmute yourselves if you want to participate, but you can stay silent if you want. So there are 2 rounds of this. This is round 1, obviously. So when Ali was when the name was Ali was shortlisted on 19% of occasions. So when the candidate's name was Lars shortlisted on fewer occasions or more occasions than Ali? So if you have unmuted, could you call it out higher or lower than Ali?
Hi, Benna. Yeah, everybody's muted.
All right,
muted, but it's okay. You can pop it into the questions tab, and we can just keep it. We can just do a quick sort of head count on what people think. Yeah. So if people just want to pop in. Sorry about that. That's fine. For
you to carry out. The Lars, higher or lower than Ali? It was higher. It was shortlisted 29% of occasions. And for Abu and Jinka, were they higher or lower than Lars? Higher or lower than Lars? They were lower. Jenny and John, higher or lower than Abu and Jinka? Higher or lower than Abu and Jinka? Give you a moment to think about it. They were higher. And then Fatma and Nasser, higher or lower than Jenny and John? They were lower. All right. So if you've got through round 1, there is a second round to come up. If you stumbled on round 1, you can still participate on round 2. But you can't win. So round 2. This is a black person without a criminal record, a black person with no criminal record. So it wasn't just the name that was changed here. They manipulated some of the details, but this was a black person with no criminal record, was shortlisted on 14% of occasions. Was a white person with a criminal record shortlisted on more occasions or fewer occasions than a black person without a criminal record? It was higher. So they were shortlisted on more occasions. Aisha and Jamal, higher or lower than a white person with a criminal record? They were lower. And Emily and Neil, higher or lower than Aisha and Jamal? They were higher. And again, and the last one, they manipulated the CV. So this time, Aisha and Jamal had 8 years more experience than Emily and Neil. Was it higher? Were they higher or lower than Emily and Neil? They were exactly the same, and you get nothing for a pair, not in this game. Now, this research just summarizes a lot of research, actually. If you want to see the report on this, the OECD did a very helpful summary report of all the member nations who had done research of this kind, and they found the results were exactly the same. So all European nations have done it, North America, some countries in South America, Australasia have done it. The results were always the same. A minority sounding name was shortlisted on fewer occasions than a majority sounding name. The criminal record one was actually research looking at the impact a criminal record has on someone. The paper that was published was called "The Stigma of a Criminal Record," and they actually found, almost like a byproduct, that actually being black was more stigmatizing than having a criminal record. the research at some of the countries, in Sweden, Britain, America, Canada, they carried out the research 10 years after the original research and found no change in the results. And the last one, the Asian Jamal, the research is deliberately, they set out to find out how many more years experience would Aisha and Jamal need to be shortlisted to the same extent, and they found it was a massive 8 years more experience to be shortlisted to the same extent. So things have changed, without a doubt they've changed, but not as much as we like to think they have. So whilst the changes are great, we need to be careful about taking them at face value. It's like a virus. Racism has mutated, and part of the mutation is that we think it no longer exists. And modern racism, you give people the context and the opportunity. So modern racists actually do believe that racism is a thing of the past. They won't necessarily use racial stereotypes, but they do believe that we don't have to take any action to tackle it. But given the context and the opportunity, like in that CV research, you find that people will make discriminatory decisions. If you increase competition, you actually find that bias increases, and actually a lot of work on equality is to enable people to be judged on their talents, which is increasing competition for roles, and that's where you get an increase in bias. We're favouring this group, we're lowering our standards, we can't possibly be doing this, all that kind of stuff. The views these days get expressed indirectly. People won't talk about a group being less competent or less able so much, but they will talk about not liking a policy, which is fine actually. I mean, why shouldn't people be able to criticise a policy, except that you find that modern racists never have anything positive to say about any policy to do with equality. And rather than talk about groups differing in abilities, that will quite clearly be the old-fashioned form of racism, do talk about different groups having different values. So groups having different values. So Muslims, for example, don't hold the values of the rest of don't hold British values. And there's also an internalized conflict that we can become so concerned about revealing prejudice to ourselves that we then start to avoid contact with minorities. We avoid having contact because we don't want to reveal our own racial prejudice to ourselves. It's known as aversive prejudice, so we avoid contact with people as a consequence. They're just some of the manifestations, and there is something about how it shows itself at work. Now you'll come across the term microaggressions. I prefer the term micro-incivilities in the workplace, because I can link this to a theory of workplace behaviour, and so the theory is the theory of organisational citizenship behaviour, and that talks about civil behaviours, encouraging supportive, helpful behaviours. Where we engage in civil behaviours, performance is higher than when we engage in uncivil behaviour, isolating people, demeaning them, humiliating them, harassing them. In those situations, uncivil behaviour leads to poorer performance. So I prefer the term micro-incivilities for the workplace because I can link it to a theory of performance. And my definition is the kinds of commonplace behaviours or aspects of an environment which signal, wittingly or unwittingly, to members of our groups that they do not belong and are not welcome. And these are micro behaviours. Some examples, research has shown that minorities are more likely to be ignored in meetings, and when they do speak up, are more likely to be interrupted. They're more likely to have the magnifying glass applied to them. So anything they do, particularly the mistakes, will be picked up on and made to seem bigger than they really are. They're referred to as over scrutiny, always being criticised for even the smallest thing and never receiving any praise. Being judged in very stereotypical terms according to the group that people think they belong to. So Asians will be seen as too servile, too quiet, too subservient, no leadership qualities therefore. Black people, men and women, seen as being aggressive, behaving confidently, but just seen as being aggressive. In my experience, they just have to be, and they're still described as aggressive. There's 60% of minorities in a survey we carried out 3 years ago said they couldn't be themselves at work for fear of being judged in stereotypical ways. It's massive. So we have this wonderful ambition. It is a wonderful ambition to bring your whole self to work. It's 60% of minorities told us That's not a reality for them. Not giving somebody eye contact is the smallest behaviour I've come across that can make somebody feel excluded. I mean, it's tiny. I think it's smaller than that, the gap between my thumb and forefinger. It's not moving my eyes, that fraction of an inch to look at that person. This isn't about people who are considerably shy or have difficulty looking at others because they don't look at anybody. This is about that person you don't look at. And you may not be aware you're doing it. Others may not be aware that you're doing it, but that person knows. How do you complain? They weren't looking at me in the meeting. So how old are you? Why don't you grow up? And that's because we underestimate the significance of eye contact, human beings. At its basic level, it shows that I acknowledge your presence in the room. But beyond that, it transmits emotion, trust, value, respect. And denying somebody eye contact denies them that emotional connection between the two. It's that important. And then consistently not pronouncing someone's name correctly and not being bothered about it either. So there's a bit before that statement there on the slide and a bit afterwards. Consistently not pronouncing someone's name correctly and not being bothered about it. I've come across many minorities now who said they've told me, I know the difference when somebody's trying and I know when they're not bothered. So these are just some of the examples of the behaviours. And the impact of these is huge. Actually, these small behaviours, it makes people feel isolated, it makes them want to withdraw, so it reduces their sense of belonging. But this constant criticism that you're getting, it reduces your self-belief and self-confidence. Dealing with this on a regular, remember these are daily behaviours, sometimes more than once in a day. It takes its toll, it's wearisome, it saps your energy, which then means you become a little less careful in other areas of your life and end up taking more risks. So eating too much of the wrong food, taking too little exercise, which then leads to weight gain and hypertension and diabetes and all these sorts of stuff. And it starts with these small behaviours. I mean, we wrote another book last year actually called Free to Soar Race and Wellbeing Organisations. We've evaluated all the evidence in there. And when you look at a topic like pay, it becomes even more apparent. And in all of these countries I looked at, some they collected the data more directly than others, but it was always the same. That black people, sometimes joined by another minority group, got paid the least. White people, sometimes joined by other minority groups, got paid the most, with others in the middle. And you look at the data for Britain, Bangladeshi, Pakistani, African and Caribbean got paid the least. Pakistani, Bangladeshi, the poorest groups. And people of Indian and Chinese heritage were above average earnings, up there with white people. But also that minorities are less likely to be employed 6 months after graduating. 3.5 years post-graduation, the pay gap between white and minority staff is growing, which actually shows that the discrimination is occurring very early on in people's careers. So they're getting that lack of progression very early on in their careers, which then means the one group will be advancing quicker than others. You've got a case study. You only have to look. You want an idea about the indifference gap. This is one of the big 4 accountancy firms, PwC. Their senior partner and chairman is Kevin Ellis. They found a gender pay gap of 14%. They made a big noise about that, quite rightly. Their race pay gap, however, was 13%, so practically the same. The bonus gap is a whopping 35%. The statement by Kevin Ellis, the senior partner and chairman, was that the pay gap is entirely driven by the fact there are more non-BAME staff in senior, higher paid roles and more BAME staff in junior administrative roles. That's not an explanation, that is a description. We knew that, Kevin. What we want to know is, why is that the case? He never explains why that is the case. So basically, he's giving you an explanation, that's all right then. And of course, since then, he's been crying crocodile tears over Black Lives Matter. But he should worry, the ethnic pay gap is now a business service that they provide. It's just a classic example of an organisation appearing to be bothered and actually not being bothered at all. They have something at PwC called colour brave. I hate that. People love it. I hate it. Who's needing to be brave when they talk about colour? And in fact, he's so brave when he talks about colour. Not only can he not bring himself to talk about black and minority staff, preferring the acronym BAME, he can't even talk about white staff, preferring the more tortuous non-BAME. So our indifference has consequences. there's daily micro-incivilities, having to monitor behaviour for fear of being stereotyped. You get overlooked early on in people's careers actually for promotion. It doesn't feel safe to speak up. 60% of minorities say they can't be themselves at work. Difficulty concentrating, the effort that it takes means that they always have to prove themselves, which takes a lot of energy, get poor pay, that impacts their performance, which also impacts their pay. The self-esteem and self-confidence is affected, and then it actually has an impact in terms of their overall health and well-being. So these small things actually have very serious consequences, and that's something that we don't recognise enough actually. So what can we do about it? Well, call to action. Well, I created a wanted poster, it's in the book. A wanted post, the RBO gang, the race-based organisation, warning, there are lots of them. And then how you can recognise a race-based organisation. There's a diversity of employees at entry level, so we try to get people in the organisation. So diversity at entry level, very few minorities in leadership roles, something I call this frosted glass ceiling. The organisation has a colour-blind diversity policy. We don't notice colour in this organisation. The gender programmes have no or few minority women on them, and nobody seems to be bothered about that either. The CEO says that he and his all-white executive team are committed to diversity and that progress is based on merit. There's Asians in technical roles, but very few in sales or customer-facing roles. There's a belief that racism doesn't exist here. There's a belief that racism doesn't exist here. After all, there's no data to prove that it does. 8, it collects no data. The website has pictures of smiling, lighter skinned minorities, but rarely on their own and never in charge. And finally, it wins diversity awards. So it needs to worry. Does that sound like any organisation that you know? The actions we take, leaders are critical. There are lots of actions all of us can take, but leaders, I found in the research, are absolutely critical to this. And there are 5 things I would leave you with in terms of leaders. First of all, accept there's a problem. Not like Kevin Ellis, just in complete denial and forced to make a statement when he does. And when he does make a statement, can't help having a link to the award that he's won for race. Apparently won sort of race ambassador award. I wouldn't make him a trade envoy. Secondly, set priorities. Have a budget. Create accountability. The number of times I've spoken to people over the last year that said, yeah, race, so serious, racism, awful, we've got to do something, we're so committed to this. Have you got a budget? No, we just thought because it's race, we thought maybe people could do it out of the goodness of their hearts. And create accountability, make people accountable, and hold yourself accountable for things you're going to do as well. Analyze, collect the data. Now, if people say it's difficult to collect the data, I get that. With ethnicity data, it's difficult to collect, even to what classifications we use. But you can collect qualitative data, interview people, their experiences, focus group data, all of it's relevant. But you can collect the data and look at what's going on in your own organisation, but turn up and make your presence felt. So leaders turning up to events, so not just putting things on, but participating. I came across a wonderful example of a former permanent secretary who turned up to a network group meeting and not to say anything, he hadn't been invited, just knew it was on, thought he'd go along for an hour, hear what the conversation was like. The impact that he had on the group was fantastic. And he remembered the impact the group had on him for what he learned. So turning up to these things, it's not enough to set them up and expect other people to turn up yourself. These are things that require very little ability, incidentally. These just require commitment. And then finally, question your practice. Ask your organisations, right? What is our talent pipeline looking like? What's the diversity of the talent pipeline looking like? What's our ethnicity pay gap? Ask the questions. You ask the questions, people know you're asking the questions, and they'll be more alive to giving the answers next time around. But above all, pay attention. And there's a role for all of us, actually. We all have a part to play. There's a line from one of my favourite movies, The Usual Suspects. The greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist. The greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist. Racism has transformed itself so successfully that some of us find it hard to believe that it still exists in our organisations. And the more we learn about modern day manifestations of racism, the more we are able to see the devil in our world and in ourselves. And of all the things I've researched, read, and reflected upon, the most astonishing is that colour prejudice is not natural. We invented it. More than that, though, it's a source of optimism. And some of the actions that we take are not that difficult. In other words, it's not a question of our ability. Instead, it's one about our motivation. In essence, how bothered are we? Conversations on race can get hearts pounding and heads spinning, but it's also a conversation to which everyone is invited and in which we can all find our true selves. Thank you, and that's the book, and I will hand you back for questions.
Brilliant. Thanks, Binna. I just found that I've already listened to this once before. Binna actually came and ran a session for us at Chwarae, and I just thought it was so good that I needed to share it with our Hive audience. So I'm glad I got to hear it again. I'll just take control from you, Binna, and start sharing my slides. Bear with me. And I've already seen that there's lots of questions coming for you already. So get ready. Okay, so look. Oh, I'll just go from the bottom. What was the name of the book released last year?
It was called Free to Soar, Race and Wellbeing in Organisations, Free to Soar.
Fab. If you can send me the links to your books later, Binna, I can send them around to the network. Somebody commented, one thing I always share is I can't be racist. I have black friends. I'm sure that people have heard this quite a lot.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think the point about that is that there's a denial that because it becomes like armor, and of course the assumptions, the stereotypes, you can still be making them. It doesn't make any of us immune from it, actually.
We have another question. The experience you shared at the beginning, Binna, really resonated. How would you recommend tackling those who are still in denial about racism in their organisation, particularly when they have a vested interest in prolonging the status quo?
Yeah, it's a difficult one, that because if you're dealing with somebody who's going to be resistant, you're going to be putting yourself at risk by doing this. The one thing I would say is don't do it on your own. Try to find somebody else who will, or a number of other people saying, you know, we need to look at this. Suppose it in forms of questions, rather questions to the organisation. Could we? I wonder what's going on over here. I wonder what's going on there. And don't do it on your own. Get somebody to buddy up with you, so you say it together. We are concerned about this, as opposed to I am concerned about this. It's more likely to bring about some sort of change. But then also refer, rather than being direct as well, you could actually say, I heard this talk the other day. This psychologist, was banging on about racism and just saying modern racism. But it was interesting, though. He's just saying, actually, the way it works today is far more subtle. What do you think about that? So actually, it's not you asking the question. You've come across something interesting. You're sharing with the individual, and maybe you could have a look at it, see what you think. So it's kind of, you do it in a roundabout kind of way. Don't try and do everything in one conversation. Don't feel you've failed if you've not managed to crack it in one conversation. But it's something you come at it from different angles and try and get conversations going in that way.
Absolutely, and create action plans as well, that you can work your way through at a place that's good for you in your organisation as well. I have another question. Listening to you talk, the historical background is so important. Have you seen Exterminate All the Brutes? Do you think that one of the answers for tackling racism in organisations is education, education, education? If so, what way would you begin?
Yeah, the education is really important. I mean, that survey I was telling you about a few years ago, the 1,500 people, the most effective action to tackle racism in the workplace was to deal with it in the moment. Right, there were other effective actions, but it was to deal with it in the moment. The people who are most likely to deal with it in the moment are white, which is a great thing. However, they were also the group who were most likely to see the micro behaviours as being unimportant. So that's a question of understanding the impact these behaviours have. So actually, they're looking out for the ugly, blunt, obvious behaviours, because their understanding is that they're the things that have the greatest impact. These micro behaviours are not racist. If they are, they probably don't have they don't affect people that much. But educating people along those lines is really valuable, I think. But the other thing we can do is that before we educate people, is having people in the right frame of mind, so that we are going to be prepared to look at issues from the viewpoint of other people, not from our own viewpoint. So that using empathy to try and understand where they're coming from doesn't mean that they agree. Doesn't mean when we empathise with somebody, doesn't mean we agree with them. We kind of understand it. We understand where they're coming from. We can understand why they're reacting on that way. And we may not, and we don't have to agree with it. So before we have the conversation, I think we need to agree what the rules of the conversation is going to be before we start getting educated about how we're going to approach this, about the respect with which we treat one another. The people need to own their own views, but they also need to be respectful in terms of how they express themselves, because people will have a variety of experiences and viewpoints of their own, and not to judge. So the rules, we need to educate, but we need to have rules about how we are going to approach the education itself.
Absolutely, Bina. I couldn't agree with you more there. One thing that really struck with me, that I really found really interesting, was the race gap you talked about, and the race bonus gap as well. Is quite frightening, and we don't hear enough about that. Do you know of any organisations that have implemented the race gap and highlight it and are working to reduce that? If there's any organisations that you can give us that we can kind of look at to benchmark. And
yeah, the BBC have. The BBC were put in a position a few years ago where they had to publish all of the people who were paid over a certain figure. I think it was 150,000. Anybody who was paid over 150,000 pounds, they had to publish all of that data, and it was predominantly. And they actually showed a big gender pay gap. But as we knew the names of the individuals, as these were public names, we actually did a race pay gap analysis on this, and we found that the hierarchy was. White men got paid the most, white women got paid the second most, and then it was minority men and then minority women. And so, and then since then, the BBC have been working really hard to look at what's been going on, and each year you find there's a greater diversity of people who are in that salary band. But it shows you actually the power of transparency and accountability. They are making themselves accountable because they had to be transparent about the data.
Absolutely, and I think the gender pay gap report, and that kind of went on hold in the last 16 months as well, didn't it? And we just need to make sure that we don't become complacent and forget about these things, and make sure that we are advertising and highlighting the gaps in gender, in race as well within our organisations, and working to reduce those. I have some more questions for you. What does a successful company look like actively looking to be anti-racist? It seems to be minorities in 9 entry-level jobs that make the conversation happen.
Yeah, where organisations are going to succeed on this is actually by creating an environment where it's safe to talk about these things. So PwC talk about being brave. It's completely the opposite that we want to do, because being brave means showing courage in the face of danger. Or something like that, if you look at the Oxford English Dictionary. Being safe means that the definition of psychological safety I like is where people feel they can speak up without any consequences to their status, their identity, or their careers. So they can speak up, and this idea that that we've created an environment of psychological safety is like a prerequisite for everything else we're doing, not just on race, but on anything to do with inclusion. And that's a demonstration by leaders, actually. I want to hear, I want to listen, I will respond. You can speak up, and then people are more likely to speak up and listen to one another. And it also has, when you look at psychological safety, it's the most effective thing for team performance, actually.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Bina. We're going to come to an end of the questions, but we will, this session is recorded, we will be sharing this with everybody. I'm also going to ask if it's okay for you, if we can send around the 5 rules for leaders, because I just feel like that list everybody will be able to take something away from today and start, working through that list and hopefully implementing those ideas and initiatives that you've suggested. So just want to thank you so much for being such a inspiring speaker and for giving us lots of food for thought as well. We are going to move on now to I'm going to give you some updates on some of the things that Quariteg is working on. So Binna, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Lovely being with you.
And you, take care.
Bye-bye. How do I leave?
It's fine. I'll just pop you on mute and then you can just
Emma, I think you're on mute, sorry.
Sorry, I've muted myself. Yeah, so I just wanted to talk to you about a project that we have coming up called Tackling Sexual Harassment in the Workplace. It's a 4 Nations approach to this initiative. We're working with the Fawcett Society, the Women's Resource and Development Agency in Northern Ireland, and Close the Gap in Scotland. And we are creating an employer's toolkit for you to take away that will be able to help you to tackle and prevent sexual harassment in the workplace. It's got lots of different elements to the project. Fawcett Society have recently carried out some research from employers and from people who have unfortunately experienced sexual harassment in the workplace. And they will be publishing a report in September with lots of recommendations for employers. We and Quariteg at the moment, we're currently recruiting some anti-sexual harassment leaders, and we're going to be training up those leaders in September and October this year. So if you want to take part in the programme, drop me an email. I'll leave my details up later. You can drop me an email on how you can get involved. It's a great programme. It's free to access. There's going to be some training days. We're going to be helping you to create toolkits within your organisations that you can use, policies as well, standalone anti-sexual harassment policies that you'll be able to implement, and working with you to create harassment-free cultures as well. So it's a great initiative. So yeah, please get in touch and we can sign you up. Also, we've got Step to Non-Exec. We're currently recruiting partners who are able to offer a placement for 12 months to women looking to achieve their first board position. So a partner organisation would be able to provide a shadowing experience for women who apply. They would be able to provide a mentor to that woman as well, and any sort of skills training that you may already offer your board. It's a great initiative to help diversify your boards, and every year at least 50% of the participants end up becoming an official board member. So it's a great programme. So again, if you want to get in touch with me, and I can sign you up for that as well. I'm also joined by my amazing colleague Hannah, who's going to come on now and tell you a bit more about our Agile Nation business programme, which you may be interested in. Hannah, are you with us? I'll just make you present, to bear with me.
There we are, I am unmuted now. Hold on a second, I'll just share my screen with you now. There we are, can you see my screen okay? Yeah, brilliant. So my name is Hannah. I'm an employer partner on the business programme, and I just thought I'd talk you through a little bit about what the business programme does that we have on Agile Nation 2. So the aims and objectives. So we exist at Quariteg to support a fairer Wales where women can achieve and prosper. So we do that by influencing and supporting businesses to adopt a number of ways that we can support women, and also champion gender equality and inclusion as a sound economic approach to sustainable business, and also improve recruitment, retention and progression of women. So the Agile Nation 2 business programme then, we take an intersectional approach to our work to ensure that inclusive practices are at the focus of the business. So we offer advice and support, best practice tools to ensure you get quality candidates, and make sure that they're not excluded from your recruitment processes, they're not overlooked for promotion, and also don't leave your organisation. So I mentioned earlier recruitment, retention and progression. So these are just sort of our 3 pillars that we try to operate the business programme under. So these are some examples I've just got on a few slides here for you. So in terms of recruitment, we look at supporting you to recruit the best people, regardless of gender and age, location, etc. Review your current working practices to help you implement best practice. And then we also offer training and support for hiring managers in inclusive recruitment practices. We've also got a Fair Play Employer Award, which you can gain as a recognition. And it also just supports your employer brand to make sure you remain competitive. Retention, so that's around, so obviously a happy and motivated team performs better, and coming to work should be a positive experience for everybody at work. So we talk through in the retention sort of pillar around work-life balance, how flexible working and changing working practices can support your employees to balance their personal and professional lives. And we look at implementing any new working practices. So we talk around smart job design and agile teams and how they react well to change, especially in the last 18 months that we've had, with a lot of organisations having to implement these changes at short notice due to COVID. And then also looking at around the way you design your roles, so around productivity and not necessarily hours, and how that can help support retention and also reduce absenteeism. And then progression then, so around creating that inclusive culture where everyone is valued. We talked briefly earlier around gender pay gap, so looking at that and helping women progress in the workplace and motivating all employees to achieve their full potential. So whether that's upward promotion, whether that's job rotation or different skills, gaining that in the workplace. And we also help review performance management processes and how you're measuring and rewarding performance within the organisation. So this is just a little map of our business programme journey. So I won't go into every stage now because I think time is running over. So, so in general, you are assigned a designated employer partner when you sign up to the programme. They support you throughout your whole journey. We carry out a review of your current working practices and your HR policies as well. We carry out a staff survey to gain the staff's views and input, because they're the ones who are going to be involved in making the change, as well as running some initial support workshops that prepare your business to be ready for the change and be in the right mindset. We then write an equality and diversity strategy, and then we agree an action plan then, so we can move forward into implementation. And implementation is bespoke to you, so it's not a one size fits all, it's what the priority areas of your business are. So implementation can involve focused workshops, it can involve one-to-one consultancy, coaching, and then also bespoke workshops that we can come up with as well. So overall, the programme takes around 9 months. And there's a couple of eligibility criteria for it. So it's a small to medium-sized businesses, they have to be based in Wales. Employees of FTE have between 10 and 250, and a turnover of less than 35 million. And it's for private, third, voluntary and charity sector organisations. There we are. And if anyone's interested in knowing more about the business programme, here's the details for the Agile Nation 2, and you can get some more information.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for sharing that, Hannah. We will send around links to this information as well. I'm just going to bring back my screen. Now, bear with me. So if you have any questions for Hannah or myself, then you'll be able to contact us. Here's my contact details as well. So if you just want to ping me across an email, we'll send out links from today to Vinna's slides as well, and to the information that Hannah shared. And if you're interested in any of the projects I mentioned as well, then please just get in touch. I just want to thank you all for giving your time today and for joining us for Hive. We will be coming back with Hive events a bit later in this year. I've just seen a message from Alexia to mention that the Agile Nation 2 project that Hannah's just discussed is free for employers to access as well. That's a really great service that we can provide to you. And we also have our Fair Play Employer service as well. If you are outside of the eligibility criteria for this, you'll be able to access Fair Play Employer. So yeah, thank you everybody for attending. Thanks for Alexia for all of your help behind the scenes, and I hope to see you all at a live face-to-face event soon. Take care everybody, enjoy your evenings. Bye bye.